In April 1945, the northern highlands of Okinawa had ceased to resemble anything the soldiers of the U.S. 96th Infantry Division had trained for. Rain had fallen so relentlessly that the mountains seemed to slump under their own weight, as if eroded not only by water, but by the exhaustion of the war itself. The ridges, soaked to the bone, looked like collapsing gray stairways, rising one after another, into a sky that never truly cleared. The air clung to the skin like a damp shroud. It carried the sour odor of decaying vegetation, the metallic tang of churned-up wet earth, and the persistent, drifting sting of smoke from shells detonating somewhere beyond the next series of ridges. For the frontline troops, Okinawa had transformed into something far more sinister than a geographical objective. It was a labyrinth that punished every step, swallowing strength, morale, and sleep. The terrain itself seemed determined to resist them. Coral rock cliffs splitting unexpectedly, terraces dropping into hidden ravines, caves yawning open in places where moments earlier there had appeared to be only shrubs and dirt. The Japanese defenders, well aware of every natural fold in the land, had turned these ridges into interlocking fortresses. Hidden tunnels connected firing points. Fake farmhouses concealed machine guns. Sniper holes lay camouflaged into the edges of terraces, waiting for a silhouette to cross their sights. Each attempt to advance, 10 meters, sometimes even 5, was a gamble that might cost several lives. A ridge that had seemed secure at dusk would erupt again with rifle fire before sunrise. Caves declared cleared the previous day would reveal new openings in the morning, as though the mountain had quietly rearranged itself overnight to keep the defenders alive. It was in this bleak landscape that the Americans established several forward aid stations. These places were not so much medical facilities as improvised pockets of temporary mercy carved out of chaos. They were set up wherever the terrain allowed it. The ruins of an abandoned shack, a shell crater widened and leveled to hold a stretcher, the charred remains of a farm shed. One such aid station was positioned beside a bridge that had taken a direct hit weeks earlier. Half of it had collapsed into a narrow ravine. The exposed beams charred into crooked black stumps. The surviving half still clung stubbornly to the muddy ground, its planks warped and creaking under every gust of wind. The soldiers called it Yawn Bridge. The name stuck instantly, not because it was funny, but because everyone who passed there seemed to be running on the last threads of consciousness. As if they might fall asleep mid-step, reinforcement units would march through, shoulders slumped, eyes half closed, helmets tilted forward by the weight of accumulated exhaustion. Some soldiers joked that the bridge itself looked tired, its boards sagging, its timbers leaning, like it might collapse not from damage, but simply from lack of rest. The aid station next to it was staffed by Army medics and a small group of Red Cross nurses. The war had stretched American logistics almost to breaking, but its medical network remained astonishingly functional. Blood plasma traveled by convoy, aircraft, and ship. Sulfa drugs arrived in small tins. Surgical kits were re-sterilized again and again. Every syringe, every scalpel, every bandage had traveled across oceans and battlefronts to reach these makeshift tents. They existed so that wounded men at least had a chance, however slim, of being stabilized before evacuation to better-equipped facilities. Among the nurses was Eileen McDowell, 24 years old, originally from Columbus, Ohio. Before the war, she had been a trainee nurse, gentle-voiced, meticulous, planning one day to work in pediatrics, but the war had torn that path away, like a page ripped clean from a notebook. She had followed the Army's movements from New Guinea to Leyte, and now stood on Okinawa, where the rain soaked through the tent canvas, and the distant sound of artillery seemed to pulse up through the very ground beneath her boots. Her training had been relentless. She knew how to clean wounds without anesthesia, how to conserve saline when supplies were low, how to keep her hands steady even when shells shook the earth. But nothing in her training fully prepared her for the sight of so many young bodies torn open day after day. The morning the story begins, the fighting on a nearby slope had erupted into chaos. A Japanese position hidden inside a limestone ledge had poured fire into an American patrol, and the ensuing battle detonated half the hillside. Within hours, the aid station was overflowing. The air inside the medical tent thickened with the smell of iodine, blood, and wet uniforms. Rain-soaked boots left brown puddles on the canvas floor. The sound of stretcher poles hitting the wooden frames became the morning's rhythm. Most of the wounded were Americans. But then a stretcher was carried in holding someone who immediately changed the mood in the tent. A Japanese soldier, barely older than many of the Americans lying beside him. His uniform was shredded, soaked through with blood, and clung to him like a second damaged skin. His eyes were closed, his breathing so faint it was almost absent. The stretcher-bearers set him down without ceremony, and a wave of silence moved through the tent like a cold wind. The hostility on the faces of several soldiers was immediate and intense. On Okinawa, hatred of the Japanese had taken deep root. Countless encounters, banzai charges, ambushes, booby-trapped bodies, cave detonations, had left the Americans wary of any Japanese soldier, alive or dead. Some had watched comrades die in sudden bursts of shrapnel after Japanese defenders feigned surrender. Others had heard stories of men dragged into dark caves and never seen again. Fear and anger had blended into a hardened instinct. The enemy was not to be trusted. A few soldiers shifted their weight uncomfortably, hands tightening on rifles. One muttered something under his breath. Another simply stared with an expression that hovered between outrage and disbelief. They all silently asked the same question. Why treat him? Why waste supplies on him? Why save the man who would never save us? But Eileen stepped forward before anyone voiced it aloud. To her, he was not enemy. He was a patient, and he was dying. She reached for his neck and felt almost nothing. His pulse fluttered beneath her fingertips, weak and erratic. His skin felt cold, almost waxy. When she lifted his shirt, the true extent of the damage revealed itself. A deep penetration wound gaped beneath his left ribs, exposing tissue that should never be visible. The edges were torn open, ragged from the force of the blast. His right leg was worse. Part of the muscle had been carved away by shrapnel, leaving an exposed wound that leaked blood in thin, watery streams. His breathing was shallow enough that she feared his lungs would simply give up at any moment. The army doctor hesitated. The soldiers tensed, but Eileen didn't pause. "Saline," she ordered softly. The word seemed to break the stillness. One soldier brought the bag forward, though his hand shook so obviously he had to steady his wrist against his thigh. Another handed her a towel, but kept his distance, as if afraid the prisoner might somehow rise from the stretcher. Eileen began by cutting away the uniform. The dried blood made the fabric stiff, and when she sliced through it, the tear sounded like something brittle snapping. She cleaned the wound quickly, letting saline wash away mud and debris. The prisoner's body twitched once, a reflex, not consciousness. The light in the tent flickered, shadows sliding across his face. For a moment she thought she had lost his pulse, but when she pressed her fingers again, she felt a faint throb. She inserted the needle for the blood plasma. It entered with no resistance. His skin was so cold it hardly reacted. The plasma began to drip, carrying warmth into a body already teetering at the edge of life. The soldiers at the entrance of the tent didn't speak. They simply stared, as if the act itself, saving the enemy, violated something woven deep into their understanding of the war. Outside, the rain battered yon bridge with steady, hollow bangs. Inside, Eileen stitched the wound, each pass of the curved needle sending a tremor through the fragile skin. She worked fast, her breath steady even when the ground shook from distant artillery. The prisoner's breathing faltered once, so completely that for several heartbeats she heard nothing. Then Eileen pressed her ear to his mouth. Nothing. She began chest compressions. Her palms slipped on blood. She adjusted and pressed again, harder. She counted in her head. Breath tight. World shrinking to the beat of her hands. Seconds stretched. She felt sweat mix with the rain dripping from the tent seams. The lantern trembled. Somewhere behind her a soldier whispered, "He's gone." And then, barely perceptible, a breath escaped the prisoner's lungs, so faint she almost missed it. Then another. The soldiers fell silent again, but this time their silence carried weight, not hostility. Eileen resumed her work. She stitched, cleaned, bandaged, checked, repeated. She did not stop until the bleeding slowed, until his pulse steadied into something fragile but real. When she finally stepped back, her gloves were soaked dark red to the wrist. A basin of water beside her had turned almost black. The prisoner lived, barely, but undeniably. And for the first time that day, the soldier standing near the entrance seemed unsure what to do with the fact that he had. Night fell slowly over the northern foothills of Okinawa, but it brought no comfort. The clouds were still thick, turning the sky into a heavy lid of gray. Occasionally, the distant rumble of artillery rolled across the mountains like a slow breath from an unseen giant. Yet around yon bridge, something had shifted. Subtle, almost invisible, but undeniably present. The aid station had quieted after the frantic rush of the morning and afternoon. Soldiers waited near a cook stove outside, collecting their evening rations with a subdued calm. The sound of metal ladles striking the lip of a pot echoed through the damp air, but even that felt muted, as though everyone was speaking, moving, and breathing under an unspoken weight. Usually men would joke, swap curses, or tease each other over the thin stew. Tonight, they simply took their food, walked to the broken bridge, and sat with their helmets lowered, eating without a word. Some stole glances toward the medical tent. None held the glance for more than a heartbeat. What they had witnessed hours earlier was something they didn't know how to categorize. Many had expected the Japanese prisoner to die, and truthfully, some had quietly believed that would be the cleaner outcome. Not because they relished death, but because war had conditioned them to simplify the world into survival and threat, friend and enemy, forward and backward. Saving the man who, only that morning, would have shot at them from a cave felt like introducing a contradiction into a system that was already unbearably fragile. Yet there he was, alive, held together by thread, plasma, and the determination of a nurse who refused to see an enemy where she saw a patient. Inside the tent, Eileen sat beside the prisoner on a wooden crate, her hands trembling faintly from exhaustion. Her hair clung to her forehead, damp from sweat and the humidity that seemed woven into the very air. She had changed into a fresh pair of gloves, but had yet to rest even for a moment. Every few minutes she leaned in to check the prisoner's breathing, closing her eyes briefly to tune out the rain and listen only to the faint rise and fall of his chest. She wrote notes into a small medical log: pulse at time of initial contact, estimated blood loss, wound depth, response to chest compressions, volume of plasma administered, stabilizing measures taken. Her handwriting was normally neat, almost delicate, but tonight it wavered, each letter dipping slightly as if weighed down by something invisible. On the stretcher, the prisoner's chest moved in shallow, trembling rhythms. The blanket covering him rose barely half an inch with each breath. His face was pale, almost translucent, the skin stretched tight across the cheekbones. Occasionally, a faint tremor passed through him, either pain, residual shock, or the lingering cold that even the blankets couldn't fully chase off. Outside the tent, 2 soldiers lingered near the entrance, leaning silently on their rifles. The rain had eased into a mist, and droplets collected on their helmets before slipping down onto their cheeks, making it hard to tell if any of the wetness came from something other than the weather. They watched the outline of the nurse inside the tent, not with suspicion, but with a quiet, troubled curiosity. One of them, a young combat engineer named Harris, finally took a breath and stepped just inside the tent flap. He didn't speak. He simply removed his waterproof jacket and placed it carefully on the crate beside the prisoner's stretcher. He pressed the edge of the jacket beneath the frame so it wouldn't slip. Then he stepped back out into the night without explanation. Eileen looked up briefly, acknowledging the gesture with a small nod to his retreating figure. He didn't turn around. Rainwater gathered at the edge of the broken bridge, dripping rhythmically into the ravine below. The sound was hollow and repetitive, like a ticking clock with no meaning except to mark the passing of another hour of war. The bridge, half destroyed, loomed in the dark like a crooked monument, a reminder of everything that had been broken long before the wounded man had arrived at the aid station. Time stretched thin. Another hour passed, then another. The prisoner's pulse steadied into a weak but consistent pattern. His breathing, though shallow, remained even. Eileen allowed herself a small exhale, a tiny release of a pressure she had held in her chest since the moment she began the resuscitation. The army doctor checked the patient once, nodding with a mixture of surprise and reluctant respect. "He's holding on," he murmured. That was all. No praise, no commentary, just a statement of fact. the only language the battlefield trusted. When dawn finally arrived, it did so quietly. A veil of pale mist rose from the ravine, curling around the beams of yon bridge like ghostly fingers. The rain had stopped sometime during the early hours, though the soaked earth still glistened as if holding the memory of the storm. A faint light eased its way through the clouds, washing the landscape in gray-blue hues. The aid station awoke with renewed activity. New casualties arrived. Medics hurried between stretchers. Water boiled on a small stove, steam drifting into the cool morning air. And through it all, the Japanese prisoner still breathed. Eileen checked his temperature, gently lifting the edge of the blanket. The man's skin felt warmer beneath her touch. Not by much, but enough to signal that his body was slowly, painfully attempting to repair itself. She wrote a few more notes in her log, her exhaustion softened by a quiet sense of accomplishment. Several soldiers from the previous day stood nearby, no longer avoiding the sight of the stretcher. Their expressions had shifted from suspicion to something more complex, an uncertain contemplation. Some crossed their arms, others kept their hands in their pockets. One bent slightly to look more closely before straightening up quickly, as though caught doing something improper. One of them, a sergeant whose voice usually carried the calm authority of experience, muttered just loud enough for the others to hear. "Never thought I'd see the day." No one asked him what he meant. They all understood. The army doctor arrived, checked the prisoner's pulse and bandages, and made notes for evacuation. "If he makes it another 12 hours, he said, he'll be stable enough to move to a proper POW hospital." That remark seemed to anchor the soldiers to the moment. The war outside the tent still raged. The ridges still hid threats. Men still died every hour. But here, for reasons none of them could quite grasp, they found themselves quietly hoping the prisoner would survive long enough to be transported. Somewhere in their unspoken thoughts was the realization that witnessing the rescue, a rescue they had silently resisted at first, had forced them to confront something they had been taught to suppress. The enemy was not made of a different substance. His blood spilled just the same. His chest rose and fell in the same fragile pattern. His body fought to stay alive with a determination no different from their own. Hours later, a jeep rattled toward the bridge, splashing through shallow puddles. Two stretcher-bearers stepped inside to prepare for the evacuation. The prisoners in Okinawa who survived initial treatment were often transported to rear positions where medical staff specializing in POW care could offer longer-term treatment. It was far from luxurious, just another tent, another cot, but it was a safer place than the front lines. The soldiers who had witnessed the rescue gathered without prompting. They formed a loose, quiet escort as the stretcher was lifted and carried toward the waiting jeep. Eileen walked beside it, holding the IV line steady while the prisoner's body shifted slightly with each step. The soldiers walked more softly than usual. Boots that normally clattered along the wooden bridge now landed with careful precision, as though to keep from disturbing the tenuous thread of life they were accompanying. When the stretcher was secured in the jeep, Eileen stepped back, her hands finally free. The engine rumbled to life, sputtering for a moment before settling into a steady growl. As the vehicle lurched forward, the prisoner's hand twitched, just barely, a flicker of fingers. If it was intentional, no one could say. But the soldiers saw it, and for a brief, fragile moment, they let themselves believe it meant something. The jeep rolled away through the mist. The sound of its engine faded. Silence returned to yon bridge. The soldiers remained standing for a long moment, staring at the empty space where the jeep had disappeared. Some of them shifted their weight as if searching for words. None came. Others simply exhaled slowly, their breath visible in the cold morning air. Finally, they dispersed, not back to sleep. No one slept deeply on Okinawa, but back to their duties. Their thoughts, however, were not entirely where they had been the day before. At the aid station, Eileen washed her hands at a basin, letting the cold water rinse away the remnants of blood beneath her nails. She scrubbed longer than necessary, not out of disgust, but because the ritual allowed her a rare moment of stillness. She set her medical log aside and leaned against the wooden crate where she had spent so many hours. Her eyes stung, not from tears, but from lack of rest. But she allowed herself one slow blink, a momentary surrender to the fatigue pressing down on her shoulders. The bridge outside creaked in the wind, A reminder of fragility, a reminder of resilience. The war went on, but so did the memory of what had happened beneath that canvas roof, under the flickering lantern light, between a nurse who refused to yield and a patient who refused to die. The hours that followed moved with the strange rhythm familiar to those who had lived too long on the front lines, blurred by fatigue, sharpened by flashes of danger, interrupted by the sudden arrival of wounded men, or the distant crack of gunfire that sent every heart rate spiking. Yet the morning continued with an unusual quietness around yon bridge, as if the land itself remembered what had occurred the night before and held its breath. More casualties came. Some lived, some didn't. The medics and nurses worked with efficiency born of necessity. Hands moved automatically. Clean, stitch, wrap, record. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on them, but they carried it the way soldiers carried their rifles, with practiced familiarity and unspoken resolve. But every so often, a medic or guard would glance at the empty cot where the Japanese prisoner had lain hours earlier. The image of him, broken, pale, barely breathing, had carved itself into their memory far more sharply than the dozens of other wounded they'd seen. They couldn't have explained why. Something about the rescue had pierced a layer of emotional armor they didn't realize they'd built. Even now, after he was gone, his presence lingered like a shadow burned into the air. By midday, the sky had opened slightly, allowing a muted shaft of sunlight to slip through the cloud cover. It cast a faint glow on the broken bridge and the damp earth around it, illuminating the cracks and splinters in the wooden beams. In the right light, the bridge almost appeared to be reaching out toward the chasm below, half destroyed, half surviving. The bridge was a fitting symbol, half collapsed, half intact, suspended between ruin and endurance. The same could be said of the men stationed around it. Eileen moved between stretchers, checking pupils, adjusting makeshift splints, applying sulfa powder sparingly where supplies were thinning. Her hands were steady, but slow, the overnight exhaustion settling into her shoulders like wet sand. When she finally had a moment to pause, she stepped outside the tent, letting the crisp air touch her face. She looked at yon bridge, the jagged silhouette of the broken half, the mist curling beneath it like breath from the ravine. She noticed soldiers sitting nearby, quietly cleaning their boots or adjusting their gear. Their heads were slightly lowered, not from shame, but from contemplation. The usual banter was absent. They seemed to be sorting through thoughts that had no proper place in wartime. One soldier, a man in his 30s with a rough beard and the posture of someone who'd survived too many close calls, raised his eyes and caught her watching. Instead of looking away, he gave a small, almost hesitant nod. She returned it, not acknowledgement of gratitude, but acknowledgement of understanding. Both of them knew something had shifted, even if neither could explain what it was. War didn't allow moments like last night to survive very long, but they lingered just the same. As afternoon turned toward evening, the medics prepared for the next wave of casualties. Word had come down that another push toward the northern ridges would begin soon, and everyone braced themselves for more wounded. Even the wind seemed to carry a note of tension, rustling the torn edges of the tent canvas like a warning. Eileen cleaned her surgical tools, boiling water in a small metal pot. Steam rose in thin curls, carrying the faint metallic scent of heated iron. She rotated her shoulders, feeling the stiffness in her muscles. Though her body begged for rest, her mind replayed the night in flashes, the sound of chest compressions, the flickering lantern light, the sudden silence when the man stopped breathing, and then the fragile, miraculous exhale that followed. She placed her hands on the edge of the basin and closed her eyes. War had taught her to forget many things, to forget fear, to forget the faces of the dying, to forget the dreams she had once held, but she knew she couldn't forget last night. She wouldn't allow herself to. Behind her, a soft voice spoke. "You did good work." It was the army doctor, older, weary, his face lined by months of battlefield medicine. He wasn't the type to offer praise lightly. In fact, he rarely spoke more than the bare minimum required. Eileen turned slightly, unsure what to say. He nodded once, then added, "Not many people could have done what you did." She felt her throat tighten, not from pride, but from the sudden realization of how close the prisoner had come to dying in her hands. She managed a quiet response. It was the right thing to do. The doctor glanced out toward the bridge. Right thing, he repeated as if testing the words. Then he added almost reluctantly, it's the kind of thing we forget how to see. He stepped away without waiting for a reply, heading back toward the cluster of wounded waiting inside. The rest of the day unfolded in a pattern both familiar and jarring. The thunder of distant gunfire, the calls for stretcher bearers, the sharp metallic scrape of tools being prepared, the murmured reassurances offered to men too wounded to speak. But beneath that, a sense of quiet introspection permeated the station, an unspoken acknowledgement that something rare had happened. A moment of human connection had forced itself into a place defined by brutality. When night returned, the sky hung low once again, heavy with the threat of more rain. The broken bridge creaked under the shifting wind, its silhouette a dark, jagged line against the dim horizon. Eileen stepped outside briefly, taking in the cool air before returning to her duties. Her uniform was rumpled, her hair damp, her boots caked with mud. She felt the weight of the day pressing into her bones, but she also felt something else, something like quiet relief, something like restored balance. She had done what she had trained to do, what she believed she must do. And though no one would record it in a report or carve it into the annals of history, she knew that she had preserved not just a life, but a small piece of what war tried so hard to strip away. That night, after the final round of wounded had been stabilized and the lanterns were turned low, a medic approached her awkwardly. "Ma'am," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "About the prisoner." She looked up, waiting. The medic hesitated. "I'm glad you saved him." The words came out stiff, as though unused to being spoken aloud. His eyes darted away immediately after, as if embarrassed by his own honesty. Eileen smiled gently, a faint warmth rising in her chest. "Thank you." He nodded once and hurried away. Later, when the night was deep and the mountains were shadows stacked against each other, Eileen opened her medical notebook. She flipped past pages filled with vital signs and wound descriptions until she reached the back. With the stub of a pencil, she wrote a single sentence, small, almost hidden. "War teaches us to forget, but when I press my hand to a wounded chest, I want to remember that my duty is to heal, not to hate." She hesitated, then closed the notebook. She didn't expect anyone else to read it. She didn't need them to. Decades later, historians would examine military reports from Okinawa. They would analyze casualty numbers, tactical decisions, logistics charts. They would describe the island as one of the war's bloodiest battlegrounds, a place where hatred had reached its most unforgiving form. They would speak of strategy and industrial capacity, of amphibious landings and cave systems, but they would never mention the night under the flickering lantern at Yon Bridge. They would never write about a nurse who refused to let war dictate the value of a life. They would never record the way a handful of soldiers silently followed a stretcher toward a waiting jeep, unsure why they felt compelled to accompany a man who had been their enemy hours before. But those moments existed, quiet and unrecorded, shaped not by orders or strategy, but by something older and more resilient than war itself. Something that survived despite the chaos. Somewhere in the mountains of northern Okinawa, the broken beams of Yon Bridge still stand. Time has weathered them, softened them, coated them in moss. The ravine still murmurs below, its stream unchanged by history's storms. The land remembers what people forget, and perhaps, if one listens closely enough, one might still hear the faint echo of footsteps walking softly beside a stretcher, the rustle of a nurse's uniform, the quiet exhale of a man pulled back from death when no one believed he could be saved. A reminder that even in the darkest places, a single act of compassion can carve out a space where humanity refuses to die.